this is simply morally wrong, and the deprivation of a civilian population of the basic necessities of life in the course of a war is something that we believe is counter to international law, but also most importantly counter to our Jewish morals, which is why J Street is hosting this call. We want to really try to bring the situation to as much public awareness as possible, dig through all the various narratives to try to get to the facts of what is actually happening on the ground. And I really appreciate you being here. And I have to say, for those who don't know Gisha, perhaps you could describe a little bit the history of Gisha and then go into a little bit of a sort of state of the moment. Where are we today in terms of the amount of aid that's getting in and out? So Tania, Hary from Gisha, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate J Street hosting this event at this particular moment, because I think we're starting to see a few changes in policy, and I think that the tendency is for people to look away, for people to think, okay, something has changed now, aid is going in, we don't have to worry about the situation. So I think it's really critical that we're having this conversation today. So Gisha means access or approach for those who don't speak Hebrew. And yeah, we're an Israeli organization. We've been around now 20 years. We're marking 20 years of operations this year. And we've been actually following the situation in Gaza very, very closely that whole time. Our mandate is actually focused on the Gaza Strip and on the issue of movement and access, because that's the main way that Israel still has control and influence over civilians' lives, even in the wake of the disengagement, which of course happened in 2005, the year of our founding. So we've been watching the situation, and we're experts on access policy, and that really has continued since October 7th. We're monitoring very closely exactly what the policy is, what's going in and out, what's allowed, not allowed. And we're also a legal organization, so we're helping individuals to navigate what was before the permit regime and is now, whatever policy there is on evacuations or on re-entry to Gaza. And we're also doing legal and public advocacy more broadly on access policy writ large. So that's Gisha in a nutshell. Definitely invite people to check us out, gisha.org, and all the social media platforms one can think of. In terms of the situation right now, so like I said, we're seeing some changes in policy. Right at the end of July, Israel announced that it would be introducing a few new measures to alleviate or ostensibly alleviate the crisis. And this followed, of course, a total blockade on aid entry from March 2nd to May 19th. The creation of the GHF, which we'll hear about, and an allotment for some organizations to operate, which really wasn't going far enough. None of these things were going far enough really to address this massive humanitarian catastrophe that we all saw unfolding in recent months and weeks. These measures that have been introduced, and we can get into them more, things like, for example, allowing tactical pauses so that humanitarian convoys can enter, re-allowing airdrops of aid, allowing the private sector to bring in commercial goods. All of these actions in and of themselves are, of course, welcome, but I'm afraid they're not being implemented enough to really tackle the problem. And what Gisha and others, of course, are saying is that really without a ceasefire, without really a surge of aid from all crossing points, we're not going to see the situation, be addressed kind of at the root of it.
And just for folks' knowledge, J Street's position on this, of course, is that the time has come to end the war, free the hostages, and surge aid. We have an ongoing campaign and an initiative to get people to sign on, to call on leaders of the Jewish community in this country to speak out on these issues. And I'm sure we're going to be able to put a link in the chat for people who want to join us in that effort. Tania, the Gaza Strip is a small geographic area. I always struggle to find the best comparison. Yesterday, I heard that it's the size of metropolitan Detroit. So that was my latest, to give people a flavor of just how small this area is. how much aid used to get in? What was sort of the standard that we can get our heads around? How many trucks, how much tonnage, what used to get in, and what were the ways that food and other supplies got in prior to this round of the Gaza fighting?
Yeah. So, before the war, most of what was coming into Gaza was actually coming in for the private sector. You did, of course, have a majority of the population dependent on humanitarian aid, because of years of closure and restrictions on the economy of the, various kind of restraints on the economy developing. But the international organizations would actually purchase the goods that were coming in from the private sector for the most part, and some organizations were also bringing in their own, trucks of goods. But what we were seeing right before the war was somewhere around 500 trucks a day, and we're reticent to sort of count truckloads because, of course, it's really difficult to say, like to kind of count what people need in that kind of measurement. If you have just 500 trucks of flour, that is not, of course, going to address people's needs. But you would have had a combination of food items, construction materials, inputs for industry. And of course, since the war began, or I should say, right after the horrific attacks of October 7th, this decision was taken immediately to, not open the borders of Gaza, to not allow aid or any goods to enter. Of course, also to shut down the electricity supply, the water supply, no entry of fuel either, which usually compensates for lack of electricity, to run generators. And so, right away, you basically had the strip, surviving only on what was already inside. And as the war progressed, of course, we saw massive destruction, massive displacement, virtually an elimination of all local forms of food production. So agriculture, fishing, manufacturing, and this only then increased dependence on aid. So it also makes the counting truckloads a bit difficult because you can't really compare what was happening before to what is happening now. If people can't cultivate their fields, if fishermen can't get out to fish, if the local companies that were operating to make some food in Gaza can't operate, then of course you're going to need even more truckloads of aid to be coming in. And so, throughout the war, we've seen various sort of changes in policy. But for the most part, and from our perspective, there's never really been a concrete decision to reverse that initial choice of using aid access as a weapon of this war, using deprivation as a form of pressure, as a form of punishment in many cases, trying also to use aid to get people to move to different parts of the strip. So it's not even just that we can count what is going in, we also need to ask ourselves, what is allowed to come in? Where is it allowed to go? Who can distribute it? Is that distribution effective? Only by really, I think, getting at the nuance of the situation can we really understand the magnitude of this catastrophe. Because one of the things that we're seeing right now is that despite these recent changes in policy I mentioned, some aid trucks are getting in, but they're not getting to the people who need the aid, right? They're being looted, they're being self-distributed, they're being taken over by people, armed gangs and things, and then resold in the market. So you have this real situation of desperation and chaos that's been created from this deprivation that is then also affecting the ability of the aid to get around and get where it needs to go.
And prior to the March cutoff,
Yeah.
most of this was being managed through the UN, through UNRWA, through various international NGOs that had an ecosystem that understood how to get the goods in and then how to distribute.
Yes,
For hundreds of distribution sites, right? And
exactly.
and I guess that was just effectively ended, right? I mean, that whole system was brought to an end, and then when uh, the border was reopened, was that May, I think, sometime in mid-May,
Yes.
that whole system that had been in place for not only the years of the war, but prior, that was no longer in use. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I do think, one measure that could be a bit more helpful is the presence of these community kitchens that are operating. Of course, we think people should be able to, cook in their own homes and have access to food. But, the community kitchens have been an important source of food for the majority of the population. And for example, during this period of the ceasefire, where we saw the most goods coming in since October of 2023, there were about 400 of these community kitchens or distribution points that were active. After the March total blockade, week by week, we saw these kitchens just shutting down one after another because they just didn't have the goods coming in to be able to operate. And Israel then created the GHF and talked about the GHF replacing this whole UN-led but it's UN led, but it's run by a number of INGOs and also local organizations, Palestinian organizations that partner with these INGOs and with the UN to provide, food for the community. And so, Israel created the GHF and started opening these distribution sites. And of course, at the moment, there are only 4 distribution sites. So this concept of 4 distribution sites replacing these 400 distribution sites is completely ridiculous. And also the distribution sites are all located south of Wadi Gaza. So 3 of them in the very far south and 1 in the central Gaza Strip. It means the whole north of the Strip is not even accessing these GHF sites. And to give a sense of where things are today, the UN just announced today that 81 of these community kitchens are now operating. So just in the last few weeks, as more goods are coming in and the kitchens are able to restock some of their supplies, we're seeing some of them reopen, which is positive. But again, 81 compared to 400 is really nothing. So we really need to, from my perspective, keep the attention up and the pressure up, so that, aid continues to flow in, increases, and that, people can get what they need.
And what is your on the ground feel for the role that Hamas and other criminal and armed elements play in the deflection of aid from where it's supposed to get? What role is that? Is of course the rationale that Netanyahu and the IDF say for having shifted the mechanism, setting up the GHF, changing the rules of the game. They felt that the aid was being taken by Hamas for its own purposes, and they were feeding themselves, and they were then creating a black market that would provide them with funds. What's your perspective on those charges?
Yeah. I would say I would take those kinds of claims with a really huge grain of salt. I mean, I think that we need to kind of look at exactly what's been said by Israeli officials from the start of the war and, through to today. The diversion issue, I like to think, is kind of brought to people who are kind of polite company, who are concerned about the situation, who want to see civilians, not starving. And so the diversion argument is brought in, I think, as a kind of distraction from the policy, which, like I said, from the very beginning has been one of using aid as a form of pressure, a form of displacement. So I think that that's always there. And even recently with the new measures that were introduced, Israeli officials are telling the public here, we have to do this in order to deflect criticism so we can keep the war going. So it doesn't reflect a change of heart. It doesn't reflect a change in the diversion issue. From my perspective, it's, just to kind of keep, to be able to keep the war going. That's not to say that diversion hasn't occurred or doesn't occur in wartime. I mean, this is a classic kind of problem and feature of wars everywhere. But I don't see evidence. And of course, we've heard, USAID, David Satterfield, the former envoy from, the Biden administration. These kind of sources also did not see kind of widespread or systematic diversion of aid by Hamas. And organizations, on the ground, organizations that we've worked with for years and that we trust, say the same thing. The real problem is just simply that not enough has got in. and it's not, safe enough to distribute it inside of Gaza to the people who need it.
So we've had a few really good questions in the chat, and I want to raise them to you. Some are legal, some are political, some are just personal reflections. So on the legal front, what is the you are a legal organization, and that's the whole purpose of Gisha. What is the obligation under international law of the state of Israel in the posture that it's in, right? They are considered still to be the occupying force of this territory. And so what's their legal obligation to the civilian population that lives there in the time of conflict and war?
Yeah. So to try to simplify things, Israel has obligations as an occupying power. Our position is that Gaza is occupied. It's a position that was, reaffirmed by the International Court of Justice. It's the official position still held by the UN, the ICRC, the EU, I think the US, the last I checked even. And this kind of puts on Israel heightened obligations to the civilian population to see to their welfare. So it's not by any means a sort of minimal look at obligations. It's a more of a maximalist that they must do all that they can within the limits that are present to see to the welfare of the population. Parallel to this, Israel also has obligations as a party to the hostilities, and that is, in the simplest terms, to what's referred to as to allow and facilitate entry of humanitarian convoys, and to not interfere in the operations of humanitarians trying to deliver assistance. So Israel has formally adopted that is its role. In a petition that Gisha brought together with partner organizations, the state said throughout the legal proceedings, we accept our position as a party to the hostilities, not as an occupying power. And so this very minimal duty to at least allow and facilitate humanitarian assistance. But I think from what we can judge and see for ourselves throughout this nearly 2 years, that minimal obligation hasn't even been fulfilled. And certainly in the 2.5 months of a total blockade, I would say, completely in contravention to its obligations. But I do think that, the position of Israel as an occupying power, to me, is more obvious than ever. Israel is fully controlling everything that enters and exits the Gaza Strip, everyone who can enter and exit the sky, the sea, and of course, the operation also, it's deciding which organizations can operate inside of the territory. It's controlling, areas of land inside of Gaza, about 86% of the territory of the Strip, which is twice the size of Washington, D.C. So I don't know, for the people who are familiar with D.C., it's very small. It's already small, and 86% of it has been declared by Israel to either be completely off limits, a no-go zone, or under active displacement orders. So they're also controlling land inside of the Strip and access within the Strip. So I think that the assessment that Israel is an occupying power is really hard to deny at this point. It's not just our interpretation.
So the legal issues are one thing. Then, of course, there's the question of policy and what would be an alternative policy, right? The policy from day one, as you said, there were ministers very clearly saying that, we're going to cut off everything. Then there were actual times when everything was in fact cut off, and the policy of limits and trying to minimize the amount of supply that's getting in and to try to control where it's all going. That's been the policy thus far. There's an alternative strategy, which would be to flood the zone, right? I mean, and that's something that a lot of analysts have been talking about, that wouldn't there be an advantage from a policy point of view if one were to, in fact, just open up the gates, open them wide, let in as much as possible. So to the point that there was just even too much. What would be your perspective on that sort of a policy shift and why it isn't more in discussion in Israel? What would the benefits be of doing that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that has not really been entertained by Israeli officials, because they really have never let go of this concept of deprivation as a strategy. And I think that, on the contrary, what we saw just recently with the total blockade was, them finally answering to this call to kind of hit them harder and to, limit what is going in even more. And that has really been a sort of prominent call by the far right and people who don't see, not more morality or international law as a kind of compass, right? There really are no limits on that kind of vision of the world, that it's okay to starve a population of 2 million people. So I think that really has never changed as a kind of mode of operation. But I agree that certainly that, if aid and goods had been going in from the very beginning, then you wouldn't have seen, the incredible rise in prices and this kind of black market economy, the interest of armed gangs to steal the aid and resell it on the local market. I mean, the prices are ridiculous. So certainly I do think that would have taken out the kind of financial gains that were made by, whoever was making them.
Right. That's always been our position at J Street is that we couldn't quite grasp why it both made sense in terms of eliminating the black market, eliminating the incentive to steal aid, but it also in terms of Israel's reputation strategically around the world, to be seen as a country that was trying to do all that it could and more, would seem to be in the Israeli national interest, as opposed to be seen as a country that is in the deprivation mode that you're talking about. I also just want to note in terms of some of the questions and comments, as always in a webinar on these things, there's some back and forth going on. I just want to be really clear that the conditions in which the hostages are being held are also, of course, contrary to international law, are war crimes, are inhumane, are immoral. And J Street is 100% dedicated, and I know you are as well, to ensuring that every hostage is brought home as quickly as possible. And our view is that is best achieved through a diplomatic arrangement to be reached as quickly as possible to end the war, bring the hostages home, and surge aid into Gaza. So I just want to make sure that is very clear. A final question to you before we switch over. We're going to have Tony Aguilar joining us very shortly, who has been till recently was working with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is what GHF stands for, by the way. I know there's some question about what acronyms we use. So GHF. But the question that I think a lot of people have is, within Israeli society, the discussion of what is happening in Gaza has been relatively limited. I mean, I'm being polite. There's been practically no discussion. There has been a little bit of awareness in the last couple of weeks, the last few weeks, about starvation, famine, the conditions in Gaza. From Gisha's perspective, is there more that could be done by Israeli advocacy groups to bring the situation of the people, as distinct from the situation of Hamas, to the attention of the people of Israel? Is there a role for Israeli NGOs in doing more to publicize what's really going on?
Yeah. Certainly, and I think, we and others, of course, have been trying to do this from the very beginning, including trying to get more information about what's happening into Israeli media. And really, there has been a self-censorship that is wall to wall for almost this entire time. You really simply did not see any images of Gaza other than kind of these desolate landscapes of destruction, or embeds with Israeli soldiers. You didn't see faces of people. You certainly didn't hear their voice. And that is really slowly starting to change. But I would caution against some of the optimism that's out there about change in public perception in Israel. I think that, despite some small breakthroughs, we're still seeing polls showing overwhelming support for Israeli policy in Gaza, or indifference to suffering. And I think that the most that we can sort of see or acknowledge is that people acknowledge that they're suffering, but they're still a far way from seeing Israeli culpability for this. And so that has been our challenge, is to really sort of expose the inner workings of these policies. And I do think that Israel is working overtime, especially now after it was very open about its strategy of depriving and not allowing aid in, and doing all of these things, to suddenly backtrack and say, oh, it's not our fault, it's Hamas, it's the UN, it's all of these other actors. It's not taking responsibility for what it has done, and the catastrophe that I think it has created in the Strip. And that certainly does not reduce the culpability of Hamas for what it has done. And certainly I agree with you 100%, the need to release the hostages without conditions. But still, I as an Israeli, it's important to me that Israel take responsibility for its part in this.
Well, one final question before we let you go and bring Tony in here. There's a lot of people who are going to watch this, and a lot of people in J Street who just want to be personally helpful, who want to do something. And so I'm curious if you have any recommendations for folks on if they do want, let's say somebody mentioned their synagogue wants to do something around the high holidays to provide assistance to people in Gaza, or if people individually want to send something and make a contribution. Where can people know that the dollars and contributions that they send are actually going to be best really used to help the people of Gaza?
Yeah. Look, I think a number of organizations are operating in the Strip, and I think all of them are doing incredible work. You know what those organizations are. I'm not going to name them by name, but anyone that you hear about operating, for the most part, I can vouch for them that they're doing important work. Including American organizations. I do think that, Gisha and organizations like us operating in Israel could also use your support. I do think that there's a tendency to want to kind of send in direct aid, but I also really believe in the importance of advocacy. And, J Street, of course, is doing that work from inside the US, and our organizations are doing it here on the ground in Israel. So there's a lot of us in this community, and we definitely need your support as well.
Well, I just want to say a personal thank you and an organizational thank you to Tania and to Gisha, that's GISHA, at gisha.org, and definitely an organization that we depend on. And I know that policymakers and political leaders in Washington really depend on your information and your expertise to support the work that is done here. So thank you very, very much for all that you do. And we will continue to be partners and to be in touch.
Thank you.